Hello everyone. Welcome to my booth. My name is Dominique C. Jeter, pronouns she, her, hers, and I will be presenting on inclusion in crisis, barriers to equitable special education. I did want to note that the title of this presentation is slightly different from the title of my actual capstone manuscript that is titled Inclusion in Crisis: How limited training, fragmented IEP practices, and policy shifts undermine equitable special education services. And I do encourage you to check out my capstone manuscript if you have the time. The purpose of my capstone is to examine inequities in special education in addition to identifying systemic challenges at the macro, meso, and micro levels. It also aims to analyze teacher preparedness in relation to IEPs and 504s and the inconsistencies that exist in both plans, in addition to proposing a toolkit that addresses these discrepancies. The problem statement that I came up with is a barrier to effective inclusion in classrooms is the limited training of general education teachers, which hinders their overall ability to support students with disabilities. General education teachers who are new to the profession may need additional assistance in understanding a student's IEP and how it corresponds to the practices that should be best used to support in the classroom to support students with individualized accommodations or modifications, in addition to the type of data that needs to be collected and how it should be collected as well. Some terminology that is important to know is the terminology provided in this presentation. I will be using a lot of the acronyms throughout the presentation, and so I do want to provide you with these definitions so that you can understand further. An individualized education plan, also known as an IEP, is a legal binding written plan specifically for public school students with disabilities, detailing goals, services, accommodations, and supports to ensure that they receive a free, appropriate public education, also known as FAPE, under the Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDA. As you can see, it was originally known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. And the IDEA Act developed, um, excuse me, the IEPs in particular are collaboratively created by parents, teachers, and specialists. It's tailored to a child's unique needs, outlining their present performance, measurable and attainable goals, specialized instruction, and how progress is monitored, ensuring access to the general curriculum and classroom. A 504 plan, also known as a 504, which is under the Section 504 Rehabilitation Act of 1973, is a federal civil rights document that ensures students with disabilities receive equal access to education by providing necessary accommodations such as extra time on tests or specialized seating to remove learning barriers, unlike an IEP, which modifies the entire curriculum for more intensive needs. 504s are typically for students with conditions like ADHD, diabetes, or asthma that substantially limit major life activities and ensure fair opportunities in public schools. I do want to note though, if a student has a proper and more extensive diagnosis of ADHD, that can correspond and correlate over to an IEP as well. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act, EAHCA, of 1975 was a law that mandated that all children with disabilities, aka students with disabilities, receive a free appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, requiring IEPs with parent involvement and ensuring education alongside students' non-disabled peers as much as possible. This act was reenacted and rewritten to now be identified as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then last but not least, I use Baltimore City Public School System, also known as BCPSS. I may refer to it as BCPS, referring to Baltimore City Public Schools. So what are the issues? That's a great question. Number one addresses that one of the issues is inconsistent implementation of IEPs. Number 2 states that there's limited training and preparation for general education teachers. Number 3 states that we have fragmented collaboration structures, and this looks like co-teaching and collaboration spaces where co-teaching and collaboration is non-existent, where general educators and special education educators are working in separate silos. We have an equitable placement decision, such as transitional planning. This is a pivotal piece in students' lives, specifically as they're transitioning from 8th grade to high school, and high school into the job force. And then last but not least, racialized disparities and policy gaps. As I go further in this presentation, I will make further note on some of the racialized disparities that exist. So historically, what has occurred? Students were labeled as uneducable, were excluded from schools, and this came from Martin internment in 1996. I would like to note that 1996 was just over 25 years ago, and so just think about where we sat in terminology not even 25 years ago. IDEA expanded protections for students with disabilities, but inequity still persisted. Persistent segregation in Maryland and Baltimore in particular continued to occur. Let's note that that was in 2013, but Baltimore City Public Schools said that segregation was disseminated in the 1990s. Again, I do want to note that this is less than or just over 25 years ago. And then lastly, millions of students historically were denied appropriate services. So what do we see currently? Currently, general educators feel unprepared in supporting students with disabilities. IEP documents are still identified as insufficient for classroom instruction, and as you'll see later in the presentation as well, they are deemed to be very extensive when it comes to understanding how they're supposed to be implemented, insinuating that IEP documentation has a lot of written material, but not enough to actually support a student in their accommodations. Self-contained classrooms can also restrict access and a sense of belonging for classroom instruction and how students with disabilities are able to connect with their peers. Some of the additional discrepancies that exist: Baltimore City Schools and the state of Maryland has high suspension rates among students with disabilities. This also can correlate to segregation that has existed in Baltimore City Public Schools until the late 1990s. 54% of IEP students have had service lapses. This simply shows you how inequitable and how severe the importance is of students having IEP services in schools, but making sure that students are having full access to their IEPs and that there are no lapses in their services, as we can correlate this to some of the behavioral discrepancies that we see in students. And severely segregated schools persisted, and staff report confusion and fear when it comes to implementing IEPs. So the Capstone Project examines the historical, organizational, and policy-related factors that continue to shape inclusive education practices while highlighting the prominent challenges that exist at the macro, meso, and micro levels. As you can see, I've created a visual representation for us to understand micro, meso, and macro for those of us that do not know. So micro level is teacher preparation, IEP practices, and classroom interactions. I think this is extremely important to understand that if a teacher, specifically a general education teacher, is struggling at the micro level, what are the issues coming from the top down that are making it challenging for general educators to receive the training and guidance necessary for them to be able to implement IEPs and 504s appropriately. At the meso level, it's important to recognize that each district system operates on different levels. Not every district follows the same policies and procedures. Though they can be similar, they can be different in some ways as well. And then federal mandate segregation and policy shifts. We can see that ADA accommodations have changed. We can also see that through some of the legislation I've already shared, that they have been reinstated, reenacted, and that they have changed throughout time. And so, how do we continue to keep up with the changing laws and legislations that exist? The recommendation that I made in my capstone manuscript, centered around my topic, is a toolkit. The toolkit was created and recommended in order to strengthen an educator's knowledge and their competency while enhancing an inclusive learning environment. As you can see, I created a beautiful circular infographic for you that identifies the toolkit in each module and what it aims to do. If you do have some time, I would encourage you to take a look further into my booth. You'll see not only this beautiful infographic that I created for you, but I further broke down each module and what each module entails and the recommendations that I provided as to how I will address improving general education teachers' training and knowledge, in addition to how special education educators can co-collaborate them to make the best recommended practices in the classroom setting. And so that breakdown entails the research centered around it. And so the best research-based practices and approaches in education, again, are in that toolkit. So the key findings. So the historical analysis reveals that through EAHCA of 1975 and its evolution into IDA, significant protections and many students with disabilities continue to face systemic exclusion, fragmented supports, and inconsistent access to instruction. The trainings are These challenges are actively visible in districts such as Baltimore City Public Schools, where long structural inequities in conjunction with racial segregation and documented lapses in their service delivery have contributed to the gaps in educational experience and outcome. So inclusion remains inconsistent nationwide, regardless of the school district system, and training gaps continue to undermine the equity gaps in school districts. And while I understand that the toolkit single-handedly cannot solve all of the systemic inequities that shapes the educational access that students with disabilities have, it is putting forth a meaningful step towards the instructional competency, legal compliance, and equity-centered practices that exist. And so sustainable inclusion requires systemic investment. We cannot create long-term goals with short-term solutions and short-term idea plans. And so I want to thank you all for taking a listen to my presentation. And as a moment of and for reflection, I want to leave you with the following quote. Inclusive classrooms should be a paradigm shift in which human differences are not only seen, but desired in a classroom. And let this serve as a reminder that students with disabilities are humans too, just like us, and that ability is in the word disability. Again, I want to thank you so much for listening to my capstone presentation. I hope that you check out the remainder of my resources in my booth, and these are my references.